Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video, and welcome to the next installment in my guide to Victorian authors. If you haven't seen any of this series before, I will link the playlist down below so you can catch up on the introduction and the other videos. But in this series, I am basically introducing you to a lot of different Victorian authors. So today we're going to be looking at Victorian authors from George Gissing to Geraldine Jewsbury and many in between. So the first author I want to talk to you about is not actually George Gissing. I thought I would put Gissing's name in the title as he's more well known and interesting, but actually we're going to start off one author before George Gissing with W S Gilbert. Actually, Gilbert is in a way much more famous than George Gissing, but he is mostly known as a duo, as part of the duo Gilbert and Sullivan. William S Gilbert was born in 1836 and died in 1911. So William Gilbert was a playwright from London, best known, as I said, for being one of the pair Gilbert and Sullivan, who together wrote 14 comic operettas in the 1870s through to the 1890s. Operettas are basically like the precursors to musicals. As you might be able to guess from the word operetta, it means sort of like a lighter, less serious opera, and basically, as I said, they are the kind of origin of musicals. Gilbert and Sullivan are hugely influential in terms of the history of theatre and especially musical theatre, and William S. Gilbert also wrote some plays on his own, as well as some short stories and comic verse. So I have seen many a Gilbert and Sullivan play. I have seen The Sorcerer, HMS Pinafore, The Pirates of Penzance, Iolanthe, The Mikado and The Gondoliers. When I say I've seen The Gondoliers, I have acted in The Gondoliers. So my school used to put on lots of Gilbert and Sullivan operettas because the songs from Gilbert and Sullivan are actually quite easy to sing. Anyway, the only one that I was in was The Gondoliers. I was in the chorus, but I did see lots of other Gilbert and Sullivan shows put on at my school. In general, Gilbert and Sullivan shows are pretty good fun. I probably will at some point see some other Gilbert and Sullivan in my life, though I feel like I've seen a lot of the really famous ones. I am kind of interested in looking into some of William S. Gilbert's solo work though, specifically his play from 1863 called Uncle Baby, mostly just because what is that title? And he also wrote a collection of short stories and essays in the 1870s called Fogarty's Fairy and Other Tales. So I'd kind of be interested to read that. And next up, we do now get to George Gissing, who is a wonderful writer, one of my absolute favourites. George Gissing was born in 1857 and died in 1903. He was born in Yorkshire, but he spent a lot of his later life in London and writes quite a lot about London. He was from a sort of like upper working class, lower middle class background. His father ran a chemist shop, and class is very much like a huge theme within George Gissing's books. I like to call George Gissing the urban Hardy. He wrote a lot about urban poverty, especially in London, and his books are quite miserable. So I think if you like Thomas Hardy, you will probably like George Gissing. I also genuinely think he is a really fantastic writer. As well as being a writer, he also worked as a tutor, and he had a fairly tumultuous personal life. He was married twice, and both marriages were seemingly very unhappy. He also moved in sort of very literary circles in London. He was friends with George Meredith, who we'll talk about later this week, maybe tomorrow. I've lost track of which authors are which days. George Gissing wrote 23 novels over the course of his life, the vast majority of which were published in the Victorian period, although the last 3 or 4 were from the Edwardian period. He also wrote some short stories and non-fiction, including one travel writing book and one literary criticism book about the works of Charles Dickens, which I have read bits from, but I don't think I've read in full, so I need to read that sometime. So I have read 6 books by George Gissing, so to quickly rank the 6 that I have read, my least favourite by him by quite a long way is The Whirlpool. Do not start with The Whirlpool. It is a real outlier in terms of Gissing for me. This one is from 1897, so it's the latest Gissing book that I've read, and I feel like it was really bitter in a way his early books weren't. So maybe I will feel the same about other books from later in Gissing's career. Maybe I won't, but in general, I was not a fan of this one. But then the other 5 books I've read by him, I loved all of them. The Unclassed from 1884 and Eve's Ransom from 1895 are both really strong novels. And then my absolute favourite 3, I guess in reverse order, would be New Grub Street from 1891 at number 3, The Netherworld from 1889 at number 2, and The Odd Women from 1893 at number 1, although The Netherworld is absolutely amazing too. To be honest, I kind of feel like The Netherworld is probably the better book than The Odd Women, but I have such a love for the Odd Women, and I feel like the Odd Women is a pretty good place to start with George Gissing, especially if you're interested in kind of the New Woman movement and early feminist movements within the Victorian period. Although I think if you love Thomas Hardy, then the Netherworld is probably the place to start, because it is very Hardy-esque while also being exceptionally urban. I would like to read all of his books at some point. I obviously have quite a long way to go with his work, but I think the next two on my list are probably Workers in the Dawn from 1880 and Demos from 1886. In fact, I've got a physical copy of Demos. I was hoping to read it this Victober and have run out of time, but I will probably read that very soon. The next author I want to talk about is Katherine Glassier. She is also sometimes published under the name Catherine St John Conway, which was her maiden name, but she's most commonly published under Katherine Glassier. She was born in 1867 and died in 1950. She was a journalist, an author, and a socialist politician from London. She was a founding member of the Independent Labour Party in the 1890s, which is not what is now the Labour Party in the UK. So there were multiple Labour parties / organisations in the late 19th century, and the one that kind of grew into what is today the Labour Party was, I think, the Labour Representation Committee. The Independent Labour Party was to the left of that, but they were kind of affiliated with the Labour Representation Committee for a while. Anyway, Katherine Glassier began her career as a teacher before moving into politics, working as a lecturer and a campaigner, and she was also a member of the Fabian Society and married to another socialist politician. And she wrote 3 novels and a collection of short stories, and the book that I am most excited to read by her is Amy Furness, Scholar from 1896. It's about a school teacher and Christian socialism, and apparently has lots of queer undertones, and it just sounds really, really great. So I definitely want to read that one. Next, let's talk about Katherine Gore. She was a playwright and a novelist from London who was born in 1798 and died in 1861. Her first novel was published in 1824, so obviously before the Victorian period. She had quite a lot of novels from before the Victorian period, but she carried on writing into the Victorian period. She is one of what is often called the Silver Fork writers, so she was very kind of focused on the upper classes. She was a very prolific writer. I think she wrote sort of over 60 novels as well as 11 plays. I have not yet read anything by her, but I would really like to. I'm quite keen to read her comedy play Quid Pro Quo from 1844, because I'm always interested in finding new Victorian playwrights. The next novelist we're going to talk about is Sarah Grand, who I am so excited to tell you about because she's very underrated and very fantastic. Sarah Grand was born Frances Clark, and then Grand was her married name, and then she changed her first name later on in life. She was born in 1854 and died in 1943. That must have been a very interesting near century to live through. She was born in Ireland, but she moved to Yorkshire in her early life, and she was a really wonderful writer, one of the leading New Women writers of the late 19th century. In fact, it's generally thought that she's probably the person who coined the term New Woman during a debate with fellow writer Weeder, who we'll be talking about later in the week. When she was just 16 years old, she married a man 23 years her senior, and it was a very unhappy marriage, and part of the reason why she turned to writing was because she was so unhappy in her marriage. Her first novel was published in 1868, and it gave her the financial independence to leave her husband, start a new life, and she moved to London and supported herself with her writing. She wrote both non-fiction and fiction. I think she wrote 8 novels in total, 5 during the Victorian period and 3 afterwards. I've only read one, but what a book it was. The one book I've read by Sarah Grand is the Beth book from 1897, which is genuinely one of the best Victorian novels I've ever read. It is a coming-of-age story about a girl called Beth from her birth up into her adulthood. It is, I think, semi-autobiographical, or at least there are a few elements in the novel that I can see may have been inspired by Sarah Grand's life. The Beth book is one of the most complex and psychologically real novels I've ever read, and I feel like the way the book looks at Beth becoming the person that she becomes and the way her mind develops throughout her childhood, I just feel like that is so well drawn, and it's also this wonderful feminist novel, and it's just amazing. You should all just read the Beth book. I am very excited to read more by Sarah Grand. Top of my list is one of her other kind of key New Woman novels, The Heavenly Twins from 1893, which apparently partly looks at the dangers of syphilis and was considered very shocking at the time for displaying sympathy with women who had syphilis rather than condemning them. So as I said, that is top of my list, but I think at some point I would like to read everything by Sarah Grand. The next author I want to mention is Frederick Frederick Greenwood. He was born in 1830 and died in 1909. He was a journalist and a writer from London. And as a journalist, he was involved in the founding of the Pall Mall Gazette, which is pretty cool. He wrote 3 novels and has been relatively forgotten. In fact, he's best known today for finishing Elizabeth Gaskell's final novel, Wives and Daughters, which she was writing when she died. I have read the unfinished version and she maybe had 2 chapters left. So maybe at some point I should go and find the chapter or 2 that Frederick Greenwood wrote to finish it off. But I feel like Wives and Daughters is still a very satisfying novel without the final chapter or 2 that Elizabeth Gaskell sadly died before she could write. Anyway, I haven't read anything yet by Frederick Greenwood, but this October Rory Reads Anything, whose channel I'll link down below, has been reading Margaret Denzel's history, annotated by her husband from 1864, which sounds really interesting. I think it's both kind of a sensation novel and a coming-of-age story, and the form is that it is written by this woman, Margaret Denzel, but there are annotations and edits by her husband, which sounds kind of interesting, so at some point I must get to that one. Our next author is George Chetwynd Griffith, who was born in 1857 and died in 1906. He began his career as a teacher, which he apparently absolutely hated, so he turned to writing, and he wrote science fiction, both novels and short stories. He was also a socialist and a poet, and he was initially a very, very successful science fiction writer, but then H.G. Wells came along and everyone liked H.G. Wells a lot better, and therefore Griffith kind of failed a little bit in popularity. But he sounds like a really interesting writer, and I'm always keen to read more science fiction from the Victorian period. I was having a look through his work, and I feel like the book I'm most excited to read is his debut novel, The Angel of the Revolution, which apparently is a science fiction novel in which a group of socialists, anarchists and nihilists defeat capitalism through their superior knowledge of dirigibles. You know, Zeppelins, airships. How awesomely steampunk is that? I really need to read that book at some point. Next, we have 2 authors in one because I'm putting 2 brothers together, and they are George and Weeden Grossmith. So George was born in 1847 and died in 1912, and his younger brother Weeden was born in 1854 and died in 1919. They are 2 brothers from London, and as well as being writers, they are both actors and comedians. So George Grossmith was actually best known for starring in Gilbert and Sullivan operettas, and he also was a composer and wrote 18 comic operas of his own. The 2 brothers were also friends with Brandon Thomas, author of Charlie's Aunt, and various other playwrights and writers in the 1880s and 1890s. But they are best known, I would say, for the short comic novel they collaborated on together, Diary of a Nobody, which I have read and highly recommend. It is great fun, very, very silly and comedic, and just thoroughly entertaining. I am quite keen to read a little bit more by the 2 brothers though, and I would be interested to read some of the things they wrote separately. So Weeden also wrote a novel, A Woman with a History, from 1896, which sounds intriguing, and he also wrote a lot of plays. I'd quite like to read The Night of the Party from 1901, just because I enjoy that title. And then George Grossmith wrote various interesting things, one of which I think just sounds like it would be so Victorian and silly and funny, is a 1-act musical comedy called Cups and Saucers, which was mocking the Victorian craze for collecting ceramics and china. And that just sounds like the most Victorian thing that has ever been. The next author I want to mention is Ryder Haggard, who was born in 1856 and died in 1925. He was from Norfolk, although he spent a lot of his life in Suffolk, and he also spent some time living in South Africa, working as an assistant to various officials. He's best known for his adventure stories, a lot of which are kind of like colonial adventure stories, mostly set in Africa. I think he wrote over 50 novels, most during the Victorian period and a few during the early 20th century, as well as some non-fiction work. He's best known for his novels She, A History of Adventure from 1886 and also King Solomon's Mines from 1885. His legacy is complex, shall we say. In general, I think you can take it as read that an author who wrote lots of colonial adventure stories in the Victorian period probably has a complicated legacy. I haven't yet read any of his work. I'm wary of the strong racism that I gather is in a lot of his works, although I feel like some critics say that it is more complicated than that. Maybe I will read something by him at some point. I guess if I were to read anything, it would probably be King Solomon's Mines, because that's his most famous book. But you know, we will see. He's not a Victorian author who I'm especially excited to get to. But next we have a wonderful wonderful, wonderful, very important Victorian author, and that is Thomas Hardy. Thomas Hardy was born in 1840 and died in 1928, and he is one of the most significant novelists of the Victorian period. He was born in Dorset, spent most of his life in the southwest, and his novels are typically set in the historical region of Wessex, which covers various areas in southwest England. He's always an interesting author to think about because he wrote both novels and poetry, and he is really a Victorian novelist and a 20th century poet because he stopped writing novels in the 1890s after his final novel Jude the Obscure was poorly received, but he carried on writing a lot of poetry, and although some of his poetry was written and published during the Victorian period, the vast majority of it was published in the early 20th century. So he is one of my favourite poets as well as one of my favourite novelists, but he is mostly a 20th century poet, though he is a 19th century novelist. He had a complicated personal life. His marriage with his first wife was largely unhappy. They were relatively estranged by the time of her death, but her death had a massive impact on him. And I think some of his best poetry is his 1912 to 1913 poems, which were written in the wake of her death and are largely an expression of grief. After her death, he married his secretary, who he had probably been having an affair with for quite a long time. Hardy is a really wonderful writer. His novels are exceptional works of realism, and his examination of rural poverty and the impact of machinery and kind of social and economic changes on rural life are really, really interesting, as is his examination of gender roles and marriage and class. And he is known for being quite a miserable, depressing writer. Like George Gissing, Thomas Hardy wrote a lot of very, very sad novels, but they are really, really, really good. Like, so good. I have read all of Thomas Hardy's novels, as well as quite a lot of his short stories and a lot of his poetry. As I said, a lot of his poetry is from the 20th century, but my favourite Victorian poem of his is a poem called Neutral Tones, which I really, really love. In terms of his novels, I love all of them, except The Well Beloved, which is not well beloved by me or nearly anyone. It is definitely his worst book. Don't bother reading The Well Beloved unless you are a Thomas Hardy completionist, but all the rest of his books, absolutely worth your time. My top 4 books by him would probably be The Return of the Native, The Woodlanders, Far from the Madding Crowd, and Jude the Obscure. I think they're all truly wonderful books. When it comes to where to start with Thomas Hardy, I would say that The Return of the Native and Far from the Madding Crowd are probably the best places to start because I feel like they're just a tiny bit less depressing than his other novels. They're not happy, but they are less depressing. Don't start with Jude the Obscure. Don't start with Tess the D'Urbervilles. They are amazing, especially Jude the Obscure, which is probably my favourite Hardy novel, and it's just truly amazing. But they're very, very grim, and I don't think they're necessarily the best introduction to Thomas Hardy. As I said, I have read a lot of Thomas Hardy already, but there are definitely quite a lot more short stories by him that I haven't read, so I'm excited to get to them in the future. What I have read of his short fiction is fantastic. I have made many videos on Thomas Hardy before. I have done individual book reviews of all his novels, as well as a video with kind of tips for reading Thomas Hardy, so I'll link all of that down below. The next author I want to talk about is Margaret Harkness, who also sometimes published under her pen name John Law. She was born in 1854 and died in 1923, and she was a radical journalist, a socialist, and a writer. She was friends with various other socialist writers from the time, including Frederick Engels, and she wrote both non-fiction and novels. So I have read one of her novels, In Darkest London, from 1889, which I didn't love. I feel like it was one of those Victorian books that I was like, as a historian, I am fascinated by this, but as a reader, there wasn't much to enjoy in it. It's a really interesting novel looking at poverty in the East End slums, and looking at the role of the Salvation Army in trying to lift some people out of poverty. But I kind of felt like it was all of the like historical interest and misery of George Gissing, but like none of the fascinating characters and amazing writing. But I do want to read more by her because I do think it was a really interesting novel, even if it wasn't an enjoyable novel. And I'd be quite interested to read her novels A City Girl from 1887 and also Out of Work from 1888. She definitely put a lot of her sort of social criticism into her work, and that's always an interesting thing to see. Next is Thomas Hood, who was a poet from London, born in 1898 and died in 1845. He was best known for his comic verse, which was published kind of between the 1820s and the 1840s. His early Victorian poetry was quite influential. He wrote a lot for literary magazines, and one of his most famous poems is one called The Song of the Shirt, which is all about poverty in the early Victorian period. He also moved in quite literary circles and was friends with Thackeray, who we'll talk about later in the week, and in general was a fairly influential early Victorian poet. Our next author is Anthony Hope, who was born in 1863 and died in 1933. He was a novelist and playwright from London who trained as a lawyer before turning to writing. In the 1890s alone, he had 16 novels published, and he carried on writing into the early 20th century. He chiefly wrote adventure novels and is best known for his two books, The Prisoner of Zendar from 1894 and its sequel, Rupert of Hentzau from 1898, which are like political adventure novels set in a fictional European country, which sounds quite unusual, so I'm kind of interested to read one of them. The next author I want to tell you about is Gerard Manley Hopkins, who was a wonderful Victorian poet from Essex. He was born in 1844 and died in 1889. He was born in an Anglican family, but he converted to Catholicism and later in life became a Jesuit priest, and a lot of his poetry deals with themes of religion and also nature. He's quite an interesting one to talk about as a Victorian poet because actually none of his poetry was published during the Victorian period. Although it was all written during the Victorian period, it wasn't published until quite a long time after his death, when a friend of his published his poems in 1918, and they were very, very successful. His poetry is really fascinating, very, very innovative. It feels very modern for Victorian poetry. He uses something called sprung rhythm, where basically the idea is that this poetic rhythm imitates the rhythm of natural speech, with the first syllable stressed and then lots of unstressed syllables. His poetry is really, really distinctive, and I also think it is really great. I really recommend his poetry. It's really beautiful. The language and especially the nature description is really, really lovely. So I have this little collection here, one of the Penguin Little Black Classics. This is As Kingfishers Catch Fire, and this is a great introduction to his work. I highly recommend this as a place to start with his poetry, and in general I do recommend him. I think he's one of the best Victorian poets. The next author I want to talk about is E.W. Hornung. He was a late Victorian writer from Yorkshire, born in 1866 and died in 1921. He was known for his comic fiction, and he was also the brother-in-law of Arthur Conan Doyle. Hornung wrote several novels during the Victorian period, but he's best known for his Raffle series, a series of short stories and novels about a gentleman thief and his sidekick. And apparently the two main characters of the Raffles books are partly based on Sherlock Holmes and Watson, but also partly based on Oscar Wilde and his lover, Lord Alfred Douglas. So that sounds fascinating. I have been meaning to read the Raffles stories for ages and just haven't. I think the first collection is from 1899, The Amateur Cracksman, and they're meant to be really, really great. So I really need to pick up some Raffles at some point soon. Next, we have another poet, A.E. Housman, who was born in 1859 and died in 1936. He was a wonderful, wonderful poet who also worked as a university professor. He was a classicist. His poems tend to be sort of short and simple with really strong imagery, and they were really popular at the time. His best known poetry collection, which I really recommend, is A Shropshire Lad from 1896. Interestingly, a lot of the poems from A Shropshire Lad are often mistakenly thought to be World War I poetry, because some of them deal with war and conflict, and sort of young men leaving home. And his poetry was hugely popular during the First World War and brought a lot of comfort to a lot of people in the trenches. In the early 20th century, a lot of Housman's poetry was also put to music, so that also made the poems more popular. So it's really interesting to read A Shropshire Lad and think both about it as a collection coming out in the late Victorian period, but also as a collection of poetry that was very influential and culturally significant during the First World War. I really like A. Housman. I think he's a very accessible Victorian poet and a really enjoyable one to read. I have read quite a lot of his poetry, but I would like to read more, and he carried on writing kind of into the 20th century, so at some point I will get to more of his poems. And the next author I want to talk about is actually his sister, Clemens Housman, who was born in 1861 and died in 1955. She was a novelist and an artist, and she was also active within the women's suffrage movement. She illustrated for various journals and newspapers, and she also illustrated banners for the suffrage movement, which is really cool. And she also wrote 3 novels. I'm especially keen to read The Werewolf from 1896 because I'm always interested in kind of the history of supernatural tropes and how so many modern sort of horror and gothic supernatural tropes, a lot of the lore behind them tends to come from the Victorian period. I feel like I've read quite a lot of Victorian vampire fiction, but I have yet to read a Victorian werewolf novel, so clearly I need to read Clemens Housman's novel. Next we have Thomas Hughes, born in 1822 and died in 1896. As well as being an author, he was a lawyer and a politician. He was a member of Parliament several times for the Liberal Party, and he was also very interested in Christian socialism. He wrote a handful of novels as well as quite a lot of non-fiction, chiefly about religion and history, but he's best known for his novel Tom Brown's School Days, which is a semi-autobiographical novel about a young boy at boarding school, and he also wrote a sequel, Tom Brown at Oxford, later on. Tom Brown's School Days came out in 1857, and I have yet to read it. I feel like it's probably one of the most famous Victorian books that I haven't read. Well, I don't know whether it's really famous now, but I feel like 20-30 years ago it was very famous. So I need to read that one at some point. I have run out of time to film right now, so you will encounter me in a moment with slightly different lighting to talk about the rest of the authors in today's video. And we're back. Apologies for the abrupt change in lighting, but I have returned to finish off this video. So the next author I want to tell you about is Margaret Wolfe Hungerford, also published in the US under her pen name The Duchess. She was born in 1855 and died in 1897, and she was an Irish novelist, very popular in the late 19th century and the early 20th century as well. She wrote novels, short stories and articles, typically writing sort of conventional love stories. She wrote quite a lot, I think about 50 novels, and the one that I'm most interested to read is her best known novel Molly Bawn from 1878, which is a story of a very flirtatious young woman, apparently. And apparently the really common phrase, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, comes from that novel, so that's kind of interesting too. Our next author is Henry James, who was born in 1843 and died in 1916. Henry James was born in New York in the US and grew up in America, but he spent quite a lot of his life moving between Britain and the US, and from 1876 he was more or less permanently settled in Britain, so I think it is fair to claim him as a Victorian author. Some of his books are set in Britain, some set in the US, and he often kind of explores the differences between European and American society through his novels. Henry James was well connected and he knew a lot of the other authors we've been talking about, authors like Robert Louis Stevenson and George du Maurier. He wrote, I believe, 23 novels as well as various novellas and short stories. I have only read a handful of things by him, so I've read The Turn of the Screw, which is a gothic ghost story novella from 1898, which is set in an English country house and about a governess and her mysterious two charges. And I've also read quite a few short stories, but I don't remember any of them because they made very little impression on me. In general, I haven't really been enamored with the Henry James I've read so far. I haven't loved his writing style at all, and there's quite a lot of things about The Turn of the Screw that I find quite unsatisfying. However, I also feel like I haven't given him a fair try. You know, I've only read one novella and a few short stories, and I also feel like I'm slightly biased against him because I saw quite a few adaptations of his novels as a teenager that I really didn't like, but obviously an adaptation can be a very different thing from the original book, so I feel like I'm probably judging him a bit harshly and unfairly. At some point I should try some more Henry James. I think probably top of my list is The Portrait of a Lady from 1881, which is about a young American woman moving to England, and I hear really good things about that one. The next author I want to talk about is Richard Jefferies. He was the son of a farmer from Wiltshire, born in 1848, and he died in 1887, and he was a journalist and a nature writer as well as a novelist. He loved the countryside and used to go on really long solitary walks around England. He also wrote a lot about the countryside, and nature and landscape is a really important part of his work. I believe he wrote 9 novels as well as some non-fiction books, chiefly nature writing, and I have read 2 of his novels. I've read Green Fern Farm from 1880, which is a sort of rural love story. It was quite a nice, enjoyable read, quite quick and accessible, but I don't think it was especially special, I suppose. Whereas his novel After London or Wild England from 1885 is one I found much more interesting. After London or Wild England is set in a future where London has kind of collapsed and been taken over by undergrowth, and Britain has returned to like its natural wild landscape, and everyone's kind of gone back to feudalism, and then there's like a kind of chivalric love story going on, if memory serves. It has been quite a long time since I read it. After London or Wild England is probably one of those Victorian books that I feel like is academically fascinating, but I'm not sure that I love the story, but it's a really interesting concept. I need to give it a reread sometime. I would also like to read some of his other works. I'd be quite interested in reading his novel Bevis from 1882, which is a children's book and is kind of like a countryside adventure, so I think that one could be quite fun. Our next author is Jerome K Jerome, which is just like the most Victorian name there has ever been. Almost as bad as Edwin Abbott. What were the Victorians thinking? Jerome K Jerome was born in Staffordshire in 1859 and he died in 1927. He is a humorous writer, best known for his comic travel novel Three Men in a Boat, which is the only thing I've read by him. It is really good fun. It is about three men going on a boat down the Thames and all the various antics they get up to. It is very silly and very entertaining. He wrote a few other novels and some essay collections as well. And I would be interested to read more by him. His other kind of best known book is the sequel to Three Men in a Boat, which is called Three Men on the Bummel. I would be kind of interested to read that at some point. Three Men in a Boat, as I said, is really fun. The other thing I'd be quite interested to read by him is a collection of humorous essays called Idle Thoughts of an Idle Fellow from 1886. I think the title just appeals to me, I suppose. The next author I want to tell you about is a fascinating person, and that is Geraldine Jewsbury. She was born in 1812 and died in 1880, and she was a wonderful novelist and literary critic. She was from Derbyshire, that she later spent a lot of time in London. She has a lot of really interesting literary connections. So she was a very close friend of Jane Carlyle, Thomas Carlyle's wife, and there has been some speculation about whether there may have been a romantic relationship between Geraldine Jewsbury and Jane Carlyle, or potentially that Geraldine Jewsbury may have been in unrequited love with Jane Carlyle. We don't really know. We do know that they destroyed quite a lot of their letters to each other, and that the letters that we do have show a very like deep, passionate relationship between them. Geraldine Jewsbury was also friends with Margaret Oliphant and the Brownings, John Ruskin, George Henry Lewes, and as well as being a novelist, she also worked as a literary critic. So over the course of her career, she reviewed like over 2,000 novels, which is really, really fascinating. She reviewed authors like Anthony Trollope, George Eliot, and Wilkie Collins. She also worked as a publisher's reader, like reading submissions for publication. She wrote several novels and short stories, and a lot of her short stories were actually commissioned by Charles Dickens for his magazines. He was a great admirer of her work. Her novels often deal with themes of class and the position of women, and I have read 3 of her books. So I have read The Half Sisters from 1848, which in my opinion is her best book and definitely where I'd recommend starting with her work. This is a wonderful novel about 2 half sisters with very different class backgrounds. One comes from a working class background and becomes an actress, and one comes from a middle class background and kind of becomes a more conventional middle class housewife. It's kind of about their different lives. It's a really wonderful novel. I've also read Marianne Withers from 1851, which is sort of partly an industrial novel. I've also read her novel Zoe from 1845, which is about a young woman who falls in love with a Catholic priest. I enjoyed Marianne Withers and Zoe, but not nearly as much as The Half Sisters. But I do definitely want to read more of her books. She wrote 8 novels in total, and I've read 3, so I feel like that's definitely doable at some point. Her novels for adults that I have yet to read are Constance Herbert's The Sorrows of Gentility. What a great title, and Right or Wrong. And then she also wrote 2 books for children, The History of an Adopted Child and Angelo, or The Pine Forest in the Alps. So I want to read them at some point as well. And then the final author I want to talk about in this video is Edith Johnston. She was born in 1866 and died in 1902. And she was a writer and a teacher, born in Belfast, but moved to Scotland early on in her life and spent a lot of her life in Edinburgh before moving to London in the 1890s, where she began her writing career. She had a pretty tragic life. She was married to another writer, Walter Rudding, who didn't make my list. We have quite enough authors to get on with, that's fine. But he passed away like just a couple of weeks after they got married, and then she herself died 7 years later when she was only 36 years old. However, during her short life, she wrote 5 novels, some of which are considered part of the New Woman movement, and I am really interested in reading some of her books. I think top of my list would be A Sunless Heart from 1894, which is about the bond between 2 women who are struggling with poverty. It's meant to be really good, and I'm really interested to read something by her at some point. So there we go. Those are all the authors that I wanted to tell you about today. Lots more wonderful Victorian authors. Do come back tomorrow where we'll be talking about authors from Rudyard Kipling to William Morris. We have a lot of exciting people we're talking about tomorrow. Charles Kingsley, Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu, very excited to talk about him. Amy Levy, George MacDonald, George Meredith, George Moore. We have plenty more exciting authors to come, so do tune back in tomorrow. Otherwise, let me know down in the comments if you have read any of the authors I've spoken about today and what you think of them. That's all for now, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.